Welcome back to the second and final installment of our Mercedes A45 and CLA45 intake system. In this video we're going to be removing the stock intake, comparing it side by side with the carbon fibre version which we've got ready, and we'll also look at some of the CAD design elements. So first things first, let's go upstairs, look at my computer, and I'll show you some of the CAD design elements, including where the ECU is relocated and how we did that. Alright, so we've got in my screen the scans that we previously showed you for the stock system. So this is your ECU which sits on top of the airbox, then your tube which goes into the inlet system, obviously your ducting, and obviously we can see underneath where the other scans were done, showing the base of the engine bay and the mounting positions. So let me just get rid of the scans for the stock airbox and the ECU. There it is. Okay. Now I'm going to bring up first of all the bracket that we developed to relocate the ECU system. So the bracket. Okay. There's a bracket. Now, see, this is still in there, so let me just get rid of that, which is so the new bracket sits against the wall of the chassis, which you can't see here, but it's back here on this face. So that face, which is highlighted in blue now, sits along the wall of the chassis, and those two holes are where the stock torque screws secure that bracket into the chassis. So it's very secure, and then the ECU itself slots into the top of this bracket. Now if I bring the ECU in to show you, there it is. So that ECU now is where it's relocated. Just turn this around, there you go, and that's where it now sits. So it now sits vertically as opposed to horizontally across the airbox. Now with the ECU moved out of the way, I can now bring in the intake system. So I'll bring in the filter housing first. So there's the filter housing, and then the duct, and there's the duct. So it's quite close to the ECU, but there's adequate movement, or sorry, space and clearance there between the duct and the ECU. You can see the cutouts in the duct which allow for a bit of airflow to move around the ECU as well as the engine pulls in air from that filter housing. And the final piece is the cover bracket. Just finishes off that neat look to cover the ECU and the wiring harnesses from view. I'm just going to put a plane in place to do a cross section across that filter housing. Bring my planes back. Okay. Okay, that's just a cut section through the system, just to give you a better sort of illustrative view of how the airflow works and how much more straight and direct it is. So it will come in from this front duct area, which is from the front of the bumper, navigate its way through this section, straight into the filter, around the filter, through the Venturi housing, and then straight into the ECU, which is, sorry, not the ECU, the turbo inlet, which is secured to the housing with this duct, this silicon. Okay, get rid of that. So there you have it. There's our redesigned intake system and the relocated ECU, which is on the side. We'll show you now how this looks like in the car, but it's good for you guys to be able to see the ECU in the CAD, because in the car, it's so hidden, you won't really be able to see the details of that bracket in particular and how it mounts. But now you've seen it in CAD, you should be able to understand how it works now in the car. Okay, so we've seen the CAD and now we're going to have a look at the actual parts in the car. I haven't put the intake in at the moment because I wanted to show you the ECU and where it now sits, which was the most challenging part of this process. In my hand I've got the ECU bracket which we've developed. This actually is where the ECU sits into now. So the ECU slots into this bracket with a couple of nuts and bolts to secure it. This then secures onto the chassis of the car, which we'll show you now inside the car without the intake. So as you can see, the ECU is now mounted to the side of the engine bay, which is secured against the chassis of the car, and we're using the same locating points which the previous bracket was actually supporting the airbox with, but now we're using those locations to secure the ECU with this bracket. As you can see, the ECU is very stable here. It doesn't move at all because it's secured against the wall of the chassis, and this bracket is made from stainless steel in 2 millimeters thickness, and it's laser cut, so it's a very solid bracket. And you can see down in the engine bay the 2 stock torque screws which secure the bracket to the chassis of the car. Off that bracket we've got a secondary bracket, which is what the housing and the duct sit on. And then finally on top of the ECU we have this finishing bracket, which is just to make it look neat so you don't see the wiring of the connectors on the ECU. With the ECU in place, it gives us this much room now to work with to allow the airflow to come in from the front all the way to the turbo inlet. Now we're going to have a look at the actual filter housing and the duct. Okay, so in front of me I have the stock airbox and the intake that we've designed. So looking at the stock airbox first, obviously this is where it connects to the turbo inlet, so you've got a 90 degrees turn which goes into the filter. The filter sits inside this airbox system, which then draws air in from the front duct, which is connected to here. ECU sat on top of the airbox here. Now obviously the filter is quite big in there, which I mentioned previously. However, the size of that filter compared to the airbox, you can see that the filter is actually constricted inside, so it's very close to the walls of the airbox, so there's not a lot of space around the filter to breathe from. And then obviously you've got that 90-degree bend, and this tube, as you can see here as well, is quite flat around this area. So let's have a look at our one in comparison. Obviously first thing to notice is it's very straight, because now we're going straight from the turbo inlet out to the duct. We're not having to go around 90 degrees like the stock airbox and then breathe from the front. So we've got our inverted filter here, so this is actually using our patented Venturi system, and we've got our inverted filter which goes straight, no turns, well, very minimal turn, to the turbo inlet. There is a relief on this side for some ancillaries in the engine bay, and then also a relief underneath for the charge pipe. This breathes from the front duct, which I've got here, so just grab that. So the way this sits inside the engine is basically like this. So you've got a very straightforward flow path from the front duct to the filter to the turbo inlet. It seals against the front duct with this expandable rubber section. So this is fixed into place, and then as the engine moves with this can then flex, so it takes into account some of that movement. I've also had some reliefs put into the duct, which is where the ECU sits, to allow a bit of airflow to move around the ECU as well. Obviously both are in pre-preg carbon fibre, so there's no fiberglass being used, and we'll show you the inside of this as well, so you can see the actual carbon weave on the inside of the housing, and you can also see the filter on the inside as well, where the cone is. Now the advantage between this and the stock airbox, obviously first of all it's much more direct, so the airflow is much smoother, there's no sharp turns. Also, however, the filter has space on the inside to breathe from, whereas it's quite constricted here around the walls of the airbox. We don't have that problem here. We've got plenty of room out around that cone filter on the inside, where the airflow can then travel around through the filter and through to the turbo inlet. So just another thing to notice here is a comparison between the actual openings to the filter. So this is where the stock airbox opens up and draws air in from the duct, and this is where our one opens up and draws in from the duct. So you can see there's quite a big difference in size of the actual openings to the filters. That's pretty much the overview of the Eventuri system versus the stock airbox. We'll now fit the system in the car, and I'll show you what it looks like in the car. Okay, so the intake is now being installed. As you can see, we've got the filter housing, the duct, and then the ECU wiring goes over the duct. It's all nice and straight, so you've got your turbo inlet at the back here, which is breathing from the filter housing. There is no 90 degrees turn as there was with the stock airbox. It's very direct, very straightforward. Air comes in from the front, through the grill, through the duct, straight through the filter into the turbo inlet. Obviously you've got the ECU on the side, so all in it's a much neater and better looking layout than the stock system, which had the ECU on top and the wiring harness and all the wires all over the place. It looks much more aesthetically pleasing because you've got a cover of the ECU, you don't see it, and obviously you've got the carbon fiber, which looks better than plastic. All in all, it's a much more effective intake compared to the stock system because it's freer flowing. It doesn't have the restrictions of the filter up against the walls of the airbox, and the engine and ECU are able to, the turbo is able to breathe with less restriction as compared to the stock airbox. That completes our development episode on the A45 intake system. So this intake also fits the CLA45 and the CLA45S, the current generation. Please do find out from your local distributor or dealer in your region about pricing and availability. We do hope you join us for our next development video on the next intake system.